right, so let's dive in, and we're going to talk about the first foundation of accountability here, and that is that people need courage. People need courage. That's because fear dampens and diminishes ownership. It causes people to dial back their own accountability. Now, that's why we're starting here, by the way, with courage, because fear, in my opinion, is maybe the most debilitating aspect of a team or an organization when it comes to fostering greater commitment and ownership. That's because fear has sort of a double impact. Okay, first of all, fear, as we're going to talk about here in a moment, it directly harms people's level of commitment, but more importantly, it recruits people in the process of their own demise. When we were talking about that list, of raising people's level of commitment from being apathetic or grudgingly compliant all the way up to being committed, well, ultimately, that means that they have to step in more and more, buy in more and more. But when fear takes hold in an organization or a team, it causes people not only to be hesitant about that, but to begin to dial back their own level of commitment on purpose. That's because ultimately, when you're afraid of something, sometimes the only thing you can do to protect yourself from the negative impacts of that is to try to care even less. Many of us have been in that spot, but let's unpack this a little bit, because if fear is the big enemy, then your job as a leader is to combat that by driving it out and giving people courage. That's why here your main goal is to encourage and embolden people. By that I mean give them courage and make them bolder. So let's make a little sense out of this first, because sometimes I think fear is sort of a stark word to use in organizational terms. So let's start out by just kind of figuring out what people actually fear in their organizational experience. I'd like to hear from some of you. What kinds of things do people fear in organizations and teams? Rejection, okay. Fear messing up, Look, I know this is completely hypothetical. I want you to put yourself in the place of someone else in another organization and imagine, what is it that they fear? They fear rejection, they feel messing up. What else do they fear?
Not able to accomplish the task or goal.
Okay, not able to accomplish the goal. That's not just failing, but that's they're feeling incompetent or like they're ill-equipped themselves, right? What other kind of fear? They fear change. Any particular kind of change? Yeah, all of it. Yeah, people fear change. They fear the unknown, right? And what's ahead? What else? They fear being overused or used up. Yeah, absolutely. Sometimes you've heard that saying, the only reward for good work is what? More work. Yeah.
Loss.
What?
Loss.
They fear loss. Excellent. Yeah. Any others? They fear changing expectations. Like, after I am committed to this, all of a sudden I've got a new direction. Yeah. This isn't really hypothetical, is it? You know this feeling? I see the looks on your faces. I see the wheels turning here. This is something we all relate to. So first of all, as important as this is, and as much as I think by the time we're done talking about this, you're going to appreciate how debilitating it is and how much it harms commitment and accountability, let me just say this. It's present in every team. Anytime that we're collaborating, anytime we're working together, fear is present. And it's our job as leaders, if we want to foster greater ownership, to identify it and drive it out and work against it. These are some of the things that I hear often when I ask that question here. You've hit most of them here. Looking dumb or incompetent, being left out, not being cool. If you thought peer pressure and the desire to be cool ended in middle school, you're not paying attention, right? Being wrong, making a mistake, disappointing people, being overlooked or invisible or being vulnerable, not following the rules. How about this one? Not being Christian enough. You know what I mean by that? Do you know that feeling? This is certainly something that those of us that work in an area of ministry can appreciate, right? Being Christian enough. These are the things that people fear. Now, if this is what they fear, let's ask maybe a more important question. How does that affect them? How does that affect their organizational experience and performance? Thoughts? Absolutely. They lose their creativity. Yeah, creativity is sort of an inherently risky endeavor, right? And if we're afraid, not a lot of creativity, not a lot of innovation, lack of trust. Yeah, fear will just ruin trust. Here's some notes again that I've heard from other folks. I think you're hitting most of these. Think of it this way. Fear makes people smaller and less capable than they really are. And it fosters things like negative competition. That's not the kind of competition that inspires you to greater performance. That's the kind of competition that tries to get ahead by pushing other people down. Fear makes us focus on short-term goals and limits our thinking. It harms trust, as we just mentioned. It decreases our productivity, stifles innovation. Look at this. It creates an absence of joy and pride. For the sake of time, we won't go deeply into this, but let me suggest this, that if right now you're hearing me and you're thinking a little bit about your own team and whether there's fear present in it, one of the telltale signs that fear is present in your team is the absence of joy and pride. These are things that disappear first when fear gets hold. The sense of joy in the work, or pride, not in a sense of selfish ambition, but in the sense of being proud of what you're contributing to. And finally, you see their distorted communication. Does this ring true with your experience? Let's start kind of clarifying why fear is so debilitating when it comes to raising your commitment level. So let's look at where fear comes from, because if you're going to be prepared to embolden and encourage your people, you need to understand, where is fear coming from in your groups and your teams, your organizations? There are 4 main sources of fear. I'll walk through each of these very quickly. First of all, there is abrasive or abusive conduct. Okay, that's aggressive interpersonal behavior. It could be intentional, or it might even be unintentional, but it ends up intimidating, demeaning, humiliating, isolating, or threatening people. All right. Now, when I was first looking into this, I was kind of auditing my own leadership, and I'm encouraging you to do that now too as we walk through these, to consider your own team, your own leadership. And when I saw abrasive and abusive conduct, I thought, oh, I'm going to be okay on this one. Okay, I'm not an abusive person by any means. I'm not volatile. In fact, we were talking about this at the dinner table, and I said something about this when my kids were present there, and I said something about the fact that, I don't get angry, I don't raise my voice and yell or do anything like that. And one of my kids immediately said, oh yeah, but Dad, you've got the look. The look. Do you have the look? Apparently, I look under my eyebrows and speak very carefully. Do you have the look? Would people, if I had your team in here, would they say, oh yeah, he's got the look, she's got the look? Or any of these other bullets here? Take a moment and check out those bullets there to see how they apply to you and if any of them sound very familiar to you. All right, so that's the first source of fear in a team or organization. It's abrasive or abusive conduct. Now, if in reading those bullets you were feeling pretty good about yourself, you fared pretty well, and you thought, yeah, those don't really describe me and my personality, the way I lead. Hold on a minute. Let's look at the second source of fear. Not only abusive conduct causes fear, but look at this one. Ambiguous behavior by leaders is a common source of fear in organizations. What this is referring to is any sort of unclear behavior, because that causes anxiety or a tension in people, because it's really hard to read. And that leaves people really wondering what they're expected to do, or what the sort of rules are for their engagement. Now, take particular note of this, because the people that are most susceptible to this source of fear are your best people. These are the people that really are responsible, that want to be very committed, that really do want to own the mission. In fact, I dare say this describes many of you, and this is the source of fear that quickly affects them, because they really want to know how to do a good job. And if things are ambiguous, they don't know, and that causes them to be very anxious. So again, take a look at these bullets here, specifically considering your own team, your own leadership. Do any of them apply, or do any of them found sort of alarmingly familiar? Ineffective problem solving and decision making, a lack of communication or indirect communication, a lack of responsiveness to input or suggestions. Where abusive conduct was sort of a sin of commission, where it's the stuff we might do that produces fear, this comes home to roost for me, because I read this and I'm convicted by the fact that these are sins of omission. These aren't things that I did, these are things I failed to do. failed to follow through and communicate and be clear about things. All right, so that's our second source of fear in an organization. Let's look at a third one. Third common source of fear is poorly managed personnel and performance issues. This may not come as a surprise to you, but what we've learned is that the people that are on your team, the people that work in your organization, they are watching the sorts of interactions that you have regarding performance, regarding people's hiring and firing. Now, obviously, this applies to the HR department in an organization, but this applies to any of us in a position of leadership because we're called upon to make choices and have interactions about performance and hiring and firing and whether even volunteers have access to certain roles or positions or whether they don't. And look, what we find out is that people are watching those sorts of interactions. But here's the deal. They're watching it with a very particular point of view. They're looking at those things and saying, if that happened to so-and-so, it could happen to me. They start really thinking about this. Well, what would this be? What would it feel like? How could it happen to me? Now, let me ask you a question. When you're dealing with a difficult personnel issue or something that has to do with performance, do you discuss that with the entire team in addition to the person that you're having to deal with? You share all the nitty-gritty and the details of your personnel decisions? Good, that's the right answer. You shouldn't be doing that. But look at it this way. They don't know the backstory for these decisions, these things that you're doing, and that's perfectly fine. But lacking the backstory and looking at these things with that mindset of, well, if this could happen to them, it could happen to me. Here's what happens. People make up their own backstory. And they always make up the one that's most frightening to them. Does that make sense? So look, the way we handle personnel decisions and performance decisions and interactions is vitally important, not just for the person that we're dealing with, but for the greater audience that's paying attention. Now, don't get me wrong, I'm not saying that the answer to this is to include everybody in every decision in every way, and that would obviously not be a wise decision. However, being unaware of the audience or not cultivating the audience's appreciation for the criteria that you base these things on or the kind of commitments that underlie those decisions, etc., is irresponsible in many ways because it allows this kind of fear to grow in your team. And as we're learning, when fear grows, accountability falls. People stop being committed when they have to protect themselves and care less. Let's talk about the fourth one here. The fourth common source of fear in an organization or a team is the culture of that team, the culture of the organization. Now, that's kind of a fancy term that is all-encompassing because what we're talking about here is the norms in the team, in the organization. These are the sorts of traditions or beliefs, the sort of expectations that shape the way somebody behaves, what they talk about, what's in and what's out in the context of the group. Now, I'd like to draw your attention to the fact that these things are not always written down. They're not formal. In fact, one of the most powerful things that shapes the culture of your team or your organization, the people that you lead, is your personal preferences. You may not realize that because you know that they're not policies. They're just preferences. They're things that you would prefer. But look, when you're in a position of leadership, when you supervise other people, your preferences tend to fall from a height. And the people that are lower in the organization or in other roles that you're supervising actually regard those as much more firm, more like policies. And those shape the sorts of topics that they can engage. It tells people that these are the taboo topics, the sacred cows that you can't talk about. Or it tells them, hey, this is cool. This is the way you're supposed to act, the way you're supposed to look and behave. And those sorts of expectations can cause people to have the kind of fear that we talked about earlier, which is, well, how do I fare? Do I measure up to those things? Do I fit in? Am I cool? All right, so these are the four sources of fear in a team. If you haven't done it already, think a little bit about your own leadership, your own team, your own organization. Do you have fear in it, first of all? And if so, where is it coming from? Because if you want to elevate people's level of accountability, if you want to cultivate their commitment, then your job is to drive that fear out, to encourage and embolden them. So let's talk about some do's and don'ts while you're doing that. I just want to give you a couple tactics because I think this is most valuable today if you leave here with some very specific strategies that allow you to lead better and elevate the commitment level of your team. So first of all, bigger your people. Bigger your people. I was a lit major in college, and somewhere one of my professors is just having a horrible moment hearing me use the term bigger as a verb. But I think it'll stick, right? Bigger your people. But your job as a leader is to make people bigger by virtue of their interaction with you. Maybe a good way to think of this is your job is to put wind in their sails. Have you ever heard that saying? Now, not every leader does this. Not every person does this. In fact, I worked for a leader once early in my career that did not put wind in people's sails. In fact, when things got really tough, when we were really feeling down or we had doubts about our ability to pull something off, he was the last person on the planet that we wanted to talk to because he had this sort of way of discovering what last vestige of hope and potency was in you and sucking it right out. All right? It was like a superpower, not a good one, mind you, but if there was such a thing as one who puts wind in sails, he was one who sucks wind out of sails. Okay? Now, here's what I want you to think about is if you want to build people's commitment, the first thing you need to do is embolden them and encourage them. Literally, those words mean to fill them with courage, fill them with boldness, that by virtue of talking to you, they feel bigger and more capable, right? If that's your goal as a leader, then you need to commit yourself to putting wind in their sails. Wouldn't it be great if, whatever your title is, you had this sort of unofficial subtitle of putter of wind in sails? That when your people felt most concerned that they might not have what it takes or the circumstances were the most daunting, they thought, I really need to go spend time with her. I need to spend time with him because I know that after that, I will feel able. I'll feel capable. I'll feel like I can do this. Is that what your people say about you? Hopefully you're not like the guy I just described to you that I worked for. I think his unofficial title was Sucker of Wind Out of Sails, or Sucker anyway. Right? So are you one who puts wind in people's sails? That's what you want to commit to. Secondly, don't overuse fear as a motivator. Don't overuse fear as a motivator. Now, a couple things may strike you as I say that. One, that I say don't overuse it because you're thinking, oh, you can use it? Yes. Fear, in some sense, is part of every good leader's repertoire because when you talk to somebody about the importance of a task, what's relying on it, what depends upon their contribution, in a sense, you're invoking some fear because they recognize, look, if I don't pull this off well, there's a lot riding on it. And that belongs in your repertoire. But here's the problem. If that's the one tool in your toolbox, motivationally, if that's all you've got, if that's your go-to move, you're going to find that it causes a lot of problems in your organization. And rather than raising people up, it will pull them down. Rather than causing them to step up and be more committed, it will cause them to protect themselves and to back away from being more committed. That's because fear has this peculiar sort of characteristic. It's a very powerful motivator. I mean, we can use fear to motivate somebody, and it has the ability to very quickly cause people to step up their level of activity and engagement. Right? You get quick results from that. But that often misleads us or distracts us from its long-term negative effects on relationship and commitment. I know a lot of leaders, and I've been that leader at one time or another, where I recognized how quickly I could get action, how much I could get somebody to turn it up and dig in by providing a little fear, and I found myself relying on that too much. Ultimately, the reason this causes a problem is because over time, fear is desensitizing. It's desensitizing. What I mean by that is you have to apply more of it to get the same effect. And so leaders can find themselves locked in this sort of vicious cycle where they're doing things more and more that are actually driving their people away from being committed, pushing them farther down that list that we saw earlier. Right? I worked for another leader early in my career. A different leader, but with a sort of similar superpower. This leader had the ability to work the fact that my job was on the line into every task that he asked me to do. He was brilliant, tremendously creative about the way he would do it, but it was like every single task, was do or die, and if I didn't do it well, I could lose my job. He'd say, you really need to take care of this because, your job's riding on this. I hope you do a good job on this because I'd hate to lose you. All these ways. And look, the first time that he did this, it worked. Okay? As a young man, I needed the job, and I thought, oh my goodness, I had no idea. I've got to turn it up. And so I really did. I dug in and did everything that I could as a result of it. I think probably the second time, the third time, I think it worked a number of times. But you know what? After a while, I got tired of hearing that. In fact, there came a time where he basically said, look, you got to take care of this or you're going to lose your job. And this has gone on for so long that, the only thing that I could think was what? Fine, take it. Take it, it'll be a relief, right? And that wasn't because I didn't need the job. It wasn't because I didn't want the job or anything else. It was simply because I was so weary of being afraid that I just simply couldn't elicit the response anymore. Now, that's not peculiar to my situation. I see some of you nodding. You've been in some version of that before, too. And that's just the nature of fear. I mean, it's galvanizing. It causes action, but it's desensitizing over time. And now you see the vicious cycle, if you're not careful, that you fall into as a leader using this as a motivator, because you get immediate response. But the more you do this, the less somebody elicits this response. And, in fact, as that boss saw me failing to step up quite as much, what did he do? He leaned in and made the point even sharper, made me even more afraid, and that just drove me farther and farther away. You see the vicious cycle that ultimately the things that we're doing to increase somebody's motivation actually can harm their long-term commitment? So don't overuse fear as a motivator. And finally, don't punish mistakes and instead make inactivity the enemy. Now, look, I know I'm saying that provocatively because mistakes aren't good, and we have to point out mistakes, we have to address mistakes. But the reason I say don't punish mistakes is when people are more afraid of taking the wrong route or making a misstep than they are doing something extraordinary and important to the mission, then very quickly they stop taking any steps at all. They stop making any choices or any moves at all because their goal is to protect themselves. That's why we see creativity stop when fear is present. That's why innovation ceases, because ultimately the person says, the only safe spot is right here. I'm not going to step out. I'm not going to make choices. I'm not going to take those chances and risks. That sounds a lot like a hired hand, doesn't it? So your goal, if you want to raise people's level of commitment, if you want to inspire them to make the kind of choices where they put more and more of themselves in, they take more and more of a risk because they own this and buy into it more and more over time, then the first thing that you need to do is attend to any fear in your team. And you need to give them courage. Encourage them and embolden them, because of all these 5, this first foundation is maybe the most important.